My name is Emily Parker, and the day my husband called me lazy while handing me divorce papers was the day he unknowingly handed me the keys to my freedom. He walked into my hospital room like a man delivering a business memo smug, and rehearsed Danielle clinging to his arm like she'd just won the lottery. His voice was sharp cold. "You don't work, Emily. You've contributed nothing. $1,000 a month in alimony seems fair, right?" I looked up from my hospital bed IV still in my arm and smiled. I could have cried, I could have begged, but I'd learned long ago that weakness was a luxury I couldn't afford. So I just said, "Sure, let's get divorced." And in that moment, his confidence cracked. He had no idea I was worth over $450,000 a year. He had no idea my children's book series had been picked up for international film rights. He had no idea that while he'd been playing house with my best friend, I'd been building an empire behind the curtain of my silence. That smile I gave him, that was the beginning of the end for him. But let me take you back. Back to where it started, because stories like this don't unfold overnight. They're built slowly, quietly. Layer by painful layer, betrayal by betrayal. And if you've ever been made to feel invisible, like your dreams didn't count, like your voice didn't matter, I need you to hear this. You are not worthless. And sometimes the most powerful revenge is success whispered in the face of those who called you nothing. If you've ever felt underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed, leave a like. Because what you're about to hear isn't just my story, it might be yours too. We were married for 15 years. To the outside world, Thomas was the model husband, clean-cut, driven, polite. He was the guy who volunteered to coach Little League, brought homemade banana bread to the office potluck, and knew the names of every neighbor's dog. Danielle, my childhood best friend, used to call us the Dream Team. Funny how people who build sandcastles on lies think they'll last forever. The last year of our marriage was a slow funeral I attended alone. His hugs turned into nods, his questions disappeared, his phone became a brick wall, and then the betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was practical, calculated, financial. The man who once said, "I want to build a life where you never have to worry about bills," now stood at the foot of my hospital bed, trying to invoice me for my worthlessness. He saw the IVs, the pale skin, the frailty from my autoimmune flare-up, and thought that was all I had left to give. He didn't know I'd spent years publishing under a pen name, that I'd signed licensing deals while cooking him dinner, that every time he told me, "Don't worry about money," I was already out-earning him behind the scenes. He thought he was divorcing a woman who had nothing. He was divorcing a woman who'd been quietly outgrowing him for years. If you're still watching, I want you to ask yourself this: who in your life thinks you're not enough? And more importantly, why do they think that? Because sometimes the only reason they treat you like you're disposable is because they fear the moment you realize your worth. That moment for me was when Thomas slammed the divorce papers on my hospital tray, thinking it was the final chapter. He didn't know I was only just starting to write mine. If you've ever been told you couldn't make it, that you didn't bring enough to the table, that your voice was too soft, too slow, too small, comment below. I want to hear from you. Because stories like ours, they deserve to be told. And now, let me show you how I became the woman he'll regret leaving for the rest of his life. My name is Emily Parker, and before I ever became the woman who signed international publishing contracts from a hospital bed, I was just a broke, wide-eyed art student in a thrift store hoodie, sipping a single latte that had to last me all afternoon. I was 23 when I met Thomas. It was late October in Chicago, and the air smelled like burnt espresso and fallen leaves. I remember that day, down to the chipped ceramic cup, I held my sketch pad filled with animals in scarves, foxes, raccoons, a bear sipping tea in a rocking chair. I was creating what would one day become Benny the Brave, my now famous children's book series. But back then, it was just doodles, a dream I hadn't dared to say out loud yet. Thomas appeared beside my table like a gust of wind, uninvited, confident, and strangely magnetic. He was the type of man who looked like he had a 5-year plan for everything: pressed shirt, crisp khakis, a clean part in his hair that even the Chicago wind couldn't disrupt. "That's remarkable," he said, pointing to one of my sketches. "You made that character feel alive with just a pencil. You ever think about turning him into something real?" No one had ever said that to me before. Within 10 minutes, he was sitting across from me, flipping through my portfolio like it was a treasure map. He asked questions about color theory line, weight character arc stuff even my professors hadn't cared to ask. He pointed at a sketch of a fox peeking out from a hollow log and said, "That one. That's the story." Looking back now, I realize what Thomas was really good at. He knew how to make someone feel seen. And when you've spent most of your life being called the artsy girl with no future, that kind of attention feels like oxygen. He was working in marketing then, junior associate at a mid-tier firm downtown. But he had ambition. Big ambition. Said he wanted to start his own agency one day, travel the world, build something meaningful. "You and me," he said that first week. "You'll draw the stories and I'll make the world see them." At the time, it sounded like love. We started dating fast. Hiking trails, ramen joints, hole-in-the-wall art galleries. He bought me my first set of professional markers, took me to bookshops and made me promise I'd see my name on a spine one day. He'd look at my sketches and say, "This is gold. You just don't know it yet." 6 months in, he proposed at that same coffee shop where we met. Same table, same chair, a tiny silver ring bought with his tax refund. "I don't have much," he said, getting on one knee while baristas pretended not to stare. "But I'll build a life where you'll never have to worry about money. Just focus on your art." And like a fool in love, I believed him. Our wedding was in his parents' backyard. Twinkle lights, thrifted decorations, acoustic guitar in the background. His mom cried during our vows. My dad actually said, "He talks about your dream like it's his too." Everyone said we were perfect for each other. And in those early years, it felt like we were. He turned the second bedroom of our tiny apartment into a studio for me. Painted the walls white, installed lighting with borrowed tools and YouTube tutorials. Every morning he'd make coffee and ask, "What's Benny the Brave up to today?" I'd tell him about the river crossing scene I was working on, or the squirrel character I'd just created. He listened like every word mattered. He made me feel like my imagination had value. And maybe that's what hurts the most now, realizing that somewhere along the way, that version of him died. Or maybe he never existed at all. Because the same man who once taped my fox sketches above our bed to keep me inspired would later tell me I was worthless. That I didn't do anything. That I had no right to ask for fairness after he walked out. If you've ever looked back at love and wondered when exactly it turned into something else, drop a comment. Let me know. Because sometimes the red flags only turn bright when you're looking through rearview mirrors. The truth is, I didn't marry a monster. I married a mirror. And the reflection only shattered when I finally stopped dimming my light to keep his ego comfortable. In those first few years of marriage, I truly thought I had won the emotional lottery. We didn't have much, not by a long shot. Our one-bedroom apartment above a bakery downtown smelled like burnt sugar and rising bread, and the ceiling in the bathroom had a stain shaped vaguely like Texas. But Thomas, he made it feel like a palace. He built me a studio in our spare room. Not because we could afford it, but because, as he said, every artist deserves a room of her own. He would get up early, brew 2 mugs of strong coffee, and sit across from me while I sketched. Benny the Brave was taking shape page by page, line by line. I'd ask him things like, "Do you think a fox would wear overalls or a cape?" And he'd actually pause as if the fate of Benny depended on it. "Cape," he'd say. "Definitely a cape. Makes him more heroic." Back then, we were that couple people envied. The kind that made up stories about strangers while walking hand in hand through farmers' markets. He'd make up goofy voices for my characters. I'd draw little cartoons of us on sticky notes he'd find in his lunch. We built a world inside our bubble, one filled with laughter, shared dreams, and the illusion of safety. Our roles were clear. He was the provider, the one who made sure rent got paid. I was the artist, the dreamer, the soft one, the muse. And I played that role with pride, even as my career began to bloom in ways I never expected. It started small, an illustration for a parenting blog, $75. Then a spot in a local magazine. Then a small indie publisher expressed interest in developing Benny the Brave into a full picture book. It was surreal. Like watching your imaginary friend step into the real world and shake your hand. The money was modest at first, $100 here, $300 there, but it felt different. It was mine. Not because Thomas withheld anything financially. No, he paid the bills, gave me access to everything. But that money, those small checks with my name on them, felt like seeds I had planted and grown in secret, so I opened a separate account. For tax purposes, I told him, laughing it off. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I didn't want to hide anything. And yet I did. Maybe because I sensed that if I grew too much too fast, It would tip the balance we'd built. You see, Thomas thrived on being the man who made it possible. He'd say things like, "None of this would happen without me supporting you, even when I hadn't asked for support." He needed to be needed. He wore my dependency like a badge of honor, like proof that he was strong, generous, essential. So I stayed quiet about the checks. I smiled and nodded when he said we were just getting by. When royalty statements came in, I'd deposit them discreetly and continue sharing ramen dinners as if we couldn't afford steak. I wasn't being deceptive, I was being careful. Because somewhere deep down I started to wonder what happens when the artist no longer needs the muse. I wanted to believe that Thomas would celebrate my success. That the man who once said, "I see greatness in your work," would be the same man to shout it from the rooftops when the world finally saw it too. But part of me feared something darker, feared that once I no longer needed him, he'd stop loving me. Have you ever hidden a part of your success to protect someone else's ego? If that question stings even a little, let me know in the comments. You're not alone. My books started selling, slowly at first, then more steadily. A school in Oregon ordered 100 copies, then a library in Vermont. A blogger with 10K followers posted a rave review, and then came the email that changed everything. A foreign publisher wanted to discuss licensing. Still, I kept quiet, because I had learned something dangerous about love, especially the kind built on uneven ground. Sometimes the person who tells you to fly is the same one who will clip your wings the moment you start to soar higher than them. Success crept in quietly like dawn slipping through the blinds. One morning, I was celebrating a $500 royalty check by silently fist-pumping in the laundry room. The next, I was negotiating audiobook rights with a literary agent over the phone, while Thomas sat 3 feet away, completely unaware. I didn't mean for it to become a secret life, but with every new contract I signed, every new licensing offer that came in, I felt the weight of a truth I wasn't ready to share, because deep down, I knew what it meant. My independence would threaten the one thing Thomas had built his identity around: being the provider. I remember the day I bought my own iMac for the studio, paid in full. When Thomas saw the box, he raised an eyebrow. "That's top tier," he said. "We're not exactly in a position to splurge right now." "We're not," I agreed. "But I got it on discount. Business deduction." He nodded, but something in his eyes flickered. That was the first time I saw it doubt. Not doubt in me, but in the version of me he thought he'd married. He didn't ask how I paid for it. He didn't ask what business deduction meant. But I could tell the balance had shifted. Just slightly. Just enough for the foundation beneath us to crack quietly. Over time, he started calling my work "your little book thing." When I'd mention deadlines, he'd respond with a smirk. "Must be nice to get paid to draw cartoons." He said it like a joke, but it stung every time. Meanwhile, Benny the Brave had become a modest success. Not a bestseller, but enough to put my name in newsletters, get me invited to school events, earn repeat contracts. Teachers would email me saying their students used Benny in classroom projects about bravery. One little girl even dressed up as Benny for Halloween. I printed that photo and taped it to the wall in my studio. That was the day I realized this wasn't a hobby anymore. It wasn't something I needed permission to pursue. It was real. It was mine. But at home, I kept pretending. We still split meals at low-end restaurants and argued about car repairs like we were broke. Not because we had to, but because if I disrupted that narrative too much, I feared Thomas would unravel. He'd grown into the image of the sacrificing husband, the man who had carried our life while I figured things out. Letting go of that fantasy would mean admitting I'd been flying solo for years. One night after a successful virtual school event where I'd sold 300 signed copies in under 2 hours, I walked into the kitchen buzzing with pride. I was about to tell him. I wanted to. I needed to. But then he looked up from his laptop and said, "Benny the Brave again. Haven't you milked that fox enough?" The words hit harder than I expected. I smiled. "You're right, it's getting old." I said nothing more, because I knew what that sentence really meant. He had stopped believing in me. And the irony, he once said he fell in love with my imagination, my fire, my belief in magic and underdog victories. But now he couldn't stand that same spark unless he was holding the match. If you've ever had someone love your potential, but fear your progress, drop a comment. Because some people don't want a partner. They want a project that never finishes. I started saving more aggressively, moved larger contracts under my LLC, registered intellectual property under my name only. Again, not because I was hiding. Because I was preparing. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Because at some point you stop wondering whether someone will leave you and start preparing for how you'll stand when they do. And for me, that moment arrived on a crisp October night when Danielle announced she was pregnant. Thomas's reaction would change everything, but we'll get there. For now, just know this. Behind every quiet woman is a storm she's holding back for the sake of peace that was never truly hers to begin with. I'll never forget the way Thomas's eyes lit up when Danielle said she was pregnant. We were at one of our usual dinner nights, rotating between couples in our little friend group. That night, it was at Danielle and Anthony's house, a warm space filled with the smell of rosemary chicken and the sound of wine glasses clinking. We'd done this for years, laughed over burnt casseroles, played charades until midnight, talked about mortgage rates like we were real adults. But that night, everything changed. Danielle stood slowly from her seat and placed both hands on her stomach. It was still flat, still early, but her eyes shimmered when she said, "We're having a baby." And in the 3 seconds of silence that followed, something cracked open. Thomas shot up from his chair like he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. He didn't wait for Anthony the father to speak. He wrapped Danielle in a hug longer than polite, tighter than friendly. "This is incredible," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "When did you find out? Have you seen a doctor yet?" "Oh my God, we need to talk nursery themes, vitamins, birthing plans." Anthony stood frozen still, holding the dinner plates, watching the man who wasn't the father act like he was. I caught Danielle's eye. She looked proud, like she was basking in his attention, like it was hers by right. And I sat in silence, watching the man who used to ask about my dreams, now plan someone else's future down to the color of the nursery walls. That night on the drive home, Thomas talked nonstop. "Isn't this amazing, Emma baby, our first baby in the group? Just imagine the family vacations, the birthday parties." I interrupted. "It's their baby, Thomas." Of course, he replied quickly, but something in his voice wavered. "I just meant we'll all be part of this kid's life, like uncles and aunts." But something in my gut twisted. I didn't have a name for the feeling yet. I just knew the look in his eyes wasn't casual. And the truth became clearer every day after that. He began calling Danielle every morning, to check on her nausea, to remind her about appointments. He downloaded 3 pregnancy apps and set weekly reminders for fetal development updates. "The baby is the size of a blueberry now," he'd announce at dinner. "Can you believe it has a heartbeat already?" He quit smoking overnight, something I'd begged him to do for years. "It's not healthy to be around pregnant women," he said, tossing the pack in the trash. "Secondhand smoke causes birth defects." I stared at him. "I asked you to quit since we got married." "This is different, Emily. This is about protecting an innocent child." I wanted to scream, "What about protecting your wife?" But I didn't, because I already knew the answer. He wasn't protecting me anymore. He had shifted fully deeply into a role that didn't belong to him, or at least one that didn't belong to us. His concern wasn't performative. That's what made it worse. He wasn't faking. He genuinely cared. More than I'd seen him care in years. He'd tell Danielle to rest, to hydrate, to eat more greens. He brought her saltines in his glove box in case her nausea flared up. And all the while I became invisible in my own home. The man who once whispered story ideas to me across pillowcases now only spoke about prenatal yoga and crib safety ratings. He started coming home later, said Danielle needed company while Anthony worked late, claimed he was just being helpful. And I let him, because I hadn't yet accepted the truth, that I wasn't watching my husband become a better friend. I was watching him fall in love with my best friend. If you've ever watched someone slowly drift away from you, not in a fight, not in a storm, but in the gentle silence of misplaced attention, share it in the comments. I see you. They thought I was too quiet to notice. But silence isn't weakness. It's storage. And I was storing every word, every glance, every excuse, because one day they'd need to hear it all again from me. It wasn't one big moment that confirmed my suspicions. It was the slow erosion of everything we used to be. Death by 1,000 paper cuts, each one subtle, each one deniable. At first I told myself Thomas was just being a good friend, a supportive uncle-to-be. But when your husband starts knowing more about your best friend's body than he does about your heart, you stop pretending it's innocent. He started carrying ginger chews in his pockets, recommended prenatal vitamins by brand, knew the difference between hospital births and birthing centers. I'd be brushing my teeth at night while overhearing him whispering on the phone with Danielle about doulas and stretch mark creams, and when I confronted him, It's not what you think he'd say with that dismissive wave. "Danielle needs support. Anthony's barely around. You wouldn't understand, you've never wanted kids." That line gutted me. because it wasn't true. I had wanted kids. Once. I just didn't want to raise one with someone who couldn't respect me. I'd once imagined our children having Thomas's eyes and my stubbornness. But over time, those dreams withered under the weight of his disappointment, how he talked about my art as a hobby, how he made me feel small every time I achieved something he didn't control. And now here he was, playing house with someone else, building a family, one appointment, one nursery suggestion at a time. But the moment that broke me, it wasn't a kiss. It wasn't a confession. It was watching him hold her belly. 6 months into Danielle's pregnancy, we were at another group dinner. Everyone had gathered around the backyard fire pit. The air smelled like cinnamon and late fall. Danielle winced as the baby kicked. Thomas rushed to her side, knelt down, and placed both hands on her stomach like it was the most natural thing in the world. "She's getting strong," he whispered, smiling. I watched him from across the patio. The same hands that used to rub my back during my migraines, now cupping another woman's body with a tenderness I hadn't felt in years. Anthony, her actual husband, sat 2 chairs away silent. And I felt like I didn't exist. Later that night, Thomas casually mentioned that he'd signed up to volunteer coach for a youth soccer league. "I figured I should get some practice," he said, slicing into his steak. "You know, for when the baby's older." I set my fork down. "Thomas," I said quietly, "are you planning to raise this child?" His jaw tightened. "What kind of question is that?" "A real one." "You're being dramatic," he snapped. "Danielle needs help. Real friends show up, unlike some people." "Real friends," I repeated, "or real fathers." That's when it happened. He exploded. Accused me of jealousy, of being emotionally unavailable, of being cold. Said I was too wrapped up in my books to care about real life. That I was selfish for not understanding what Danielle was going through. That I had no idea what true compassion looked like. We slept in separate rooms that night. It was the first time in our marriage, but it wouldn't be the last. If you've ever been blamed for noticing what others pretend not to see, comment below. Because there's nothing lonelier than being gaslit in your own home. The next morning, he brought me coffee in bed. Said he was sorry. Promised to set better boundaries. But his apologies were like leaves in the wind, there 1 minute, gone the next. Because that same night, I caught him whispering on the phone again. "Danielle, you're not alone in this, okay? I'm here. I've always been here." He never saw me standing in the hallway. Never turned around. And I didn't say a word. Because what do you say to a man who's already moved into another life while still sleeping under your roof? I just stood there and started planning my exit. Because when someone shows you who they are, believe them. And when they show you who they love, believe that too. The day Harper was born, I watched my husband cry for a child that wasn't his. It was raining soft and steady, the kind of rain that makes the world feel quieter than usual. I stood in the hospital doorway frozen as Thomas sat beside Danielle's hospital bed, gently cradling her newborn daughter like she was made of light. His fingers traced the baby's tiny cheek with reverence. His voice cracked as he whispered, "She's absolutely perfect." Danielle beamed at him, her face glowing with that same intimacy I used to recognize when Thomas looked at me. That look was gone now, replaced by something deeper, more dangerous. It wasn't just admiration, it was devotion. Meanwhile, Anthony sat silently in the corner chair, shoulders slumped, face hollow. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a miracle he wasn't part of. And me? I stood invisible in the hallway, clutching a bouquet I had brought, unsure why I even showed up. Maybe because a part of me still wanted to believe this was salvageable, that this wasn't what it looked like. But it was. It was exactly what it looked like. From that day forward, Thomas became a fixture in Danielle and Harper's life. He visited the hospital daily, arriving with fresh flowers, stuffed animals, baby clothes he had no business buying. He knew Harper's feeding schedule better than I knew my own deadlines. He stayed for hours, learning how to burp her, rock her, change her. Nurses assumed he was the father. Danielle didn't correct them. At home, Thomas was a different man, distracted, aloof. His conversations revolved around Harper's sleep habits, her doctor's visits, her first smiles. He spoke of her with wonder, like she was his creation, his second chance. Meanwhile, my career had quietly exploded. My books were gaining national traction. I had 3 major publishers courting me, and my agent had just sent over early numbers for a licensing deal in Europe. But when I tried to tell Thomas about it, he nodded vaguely. "That's great, Em. Really." Then he was back on his phone texting Danielle. That night, I ate dinner alone at the kitchen table while Thomas sat in Harper's nursery at Danielle's house reading her a story I wrote. My story, my words, my voice. He didn't see the irony. But I did, and it burned. I started working longer hours in my studio not out of passion, but as an escape. I poured everything I had into the next Benny the Brave book, writing about a little fox who finds himself alone in the forest after everyone he loves disappears. The metaphors weren't subtle. I didn't care. Late at night, I'd stare at my empty bed, wondering if I had imagined all of it. The coffee shop proposal, the studio he built me, the dreams we used to share. How did we go from dreaming about Tuscany vacations to him spending nights rocking another woman's baby? And what hurt most wasn't even the betrayal. It was the erasure. I had become a supporting character in the life of a man I used to call mine. And Harper, God, Harper, she was just a baby. She didn't ask for any of this. And yet, she became the center of my world. I started visiting, bringing picture books, toys, sometimes helping Danielle with feedings when Thomas was busy. Danielle never protested. Maybe she liked watching me squirm. Or maybe deep down she knew Harper was mine in a way no one could explain. For the first year of Harper's life, I was still around. Not as a mother, not as a friend, just around, floating, observing, dying slowly. And Thomas, he bloomed, he thrived. He called Harper my little girl more than once. And I swallowed it, until I couldn't anymore. If you've ever been replaced in your own life, your own home, comment below. Because there's a grief in being forgotten while you're still standing in the room. It took me months to admit what I already knew. Thomas wasn't just infatuated. He was invested, heart, soul, and future. And for him to move forward, I had to disappear. But he didn't realize I don't vanish quietly. I rebuild, and I remember everything. His name was Anthony Cole, and for years he was the quiet one in our friend group. The thoughtful husband who brought the good wine to dinner parties, the man who always offered to take group photos, but rarely inserted himself into them. Danielle's husband, the one no one noticed, until he had no choice but to see everything. It was a Tuesday night when Anthony showed up at my door, eyes sunken, hair disheveled. He clutched a tablet like it was evidence in a courtroom. He didn't say hello, just stepped into my kitchen like he had done dozens of times before, but this time he didn't sit. "We need to talk," he said, placing the tablet on the counter. I was halfway through revising character sketches for a new Benny the Brave spin-off. My publisher had just approved the story arc for Benny's cousin, a hedgehog who overcomes stage fright. I'd spent hours on the illustrations that week, hoping that focusing on something pure might dull the ache growing in my chest. I wasn't ready for what Anthony was about to show me. He tapped the screen and opened a map, one dotted with colored pins. Each marker had a date time and GPS location. I blinked. "Danielle's car," he said quietly. "Same hotel. Tuesdays, Thursdays, Sundays. For the last 3 months." I didn't speak. 'Cause I didn't need to. I already knew. Anthony clicked through to credit card charges, hotel receipts, even screenshots of Danielle's calendar entries that aligned too perfectly with Thomas's client meetings. The Riverside Hotel, hourly rates, parking garage logs, photos from across the street, Thomas's car, Danielle's car parked side by side like they belonged together. And they did, at least in their version of reality. I sat down slowly, my breath caught somewhere between rage and numbness. "How long have you known?" I asked. Anthony didn't answer right away. He took a seat across from me the way Thomas used to when we first fell in love. His eyes were hollow, steady. "I suspected since Harper was born," he admitted. "Maybe earlier, but suspicion isn't proof. This..." He motioned to the screen. "This is proof." We sat in silence for a long time. No sobbing, no shouting, just the quiet mourning of two people finally holding the truth that had haunted them for years. Then Anthony said something I'll never forget. "I've been documenting everything. I didn't want to act too soon. Harper's too young, but she deserves to know the truth someday when she's ready." That night we made a pact. Not out of revenge, but out of protection. We agreed to wait, to watch, to collect. Because while Danielle and Thomas played house in the daylight, we would build a quiet case in the shadows. I began noting everything: what time Thomas left the house, when he said he'd be working late, the changes in Harper's clothes or vocabulary that mirrored his influence more than Anthony's. I started recognizing inside jokes between Thomas and Danielle, the glances they thought no one else noticed. Anthony created spreadsheets, time-stamped, color-coded, meticulous. We met once a month to compare data like private detectives in our own broken love story. And as strange as it sounds, it brought me peace. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't overreacting, I wasn't imagining it. It was real. And now I wasn't alone in carrying it. If you've ever partnered with someone in heartbreak, someone who shouldn't have understood your pain, but did drop a comment below, there's power in shared silence, and sometimes the person who truly sees you isn't the one you married. The longer we watched, the clearer the pattern became. Thomas's campaign strategy meetings were always on nights Danielle worked late. Their stories aligned too perfectly, their energy too synced. They had built an entire relationship on the assumption we wouldn't notice or wouldn't fight back. But what they didn't realize, some people don't scream, they strategize. And I had stopped being their pawn. I was becoming the player. The hardest part about betrayal isn't the act itself. It's how long you have to live with it before anyone else believes it happened. For over a year, Anthony and I met quietly, sometimes at coffee shops, sometimes in the park under the guise of bumping into each other, always with purpose. He'd show up with new data hotel timestamps, mileage logs, conversations he recorded between Danielle and her so-called coworkers. I'd bring photos, observations, and dates when Thomas canceled on me, but posted Harper's artwork on his Instagram with captions like "Family First." We weren't just building a case, we were building clarity. Because when someone gaslights you for so long, makes you question what you see, feel, know you start losing your grip on what's real. But with Anthony, the ground felt steady again. Our truth had weight, dates, files, screenshots, voice notes. And the more we collected, the clearer the timeline became. This wasn't a slip. This wasn't a moment of emotional confusion. This was years of premeditated deception. Thomas had built an entire emotional life with Danielle, one that had structure, schedules, and plans for the future. Their texts weren't flirty, they were domestic: grocery lists, pediatrician appointments, nursery color palettes, things only real partners discussed. He didn't just love her. He had replaced me with her piece by quiet piece. Meanwhile, Harper was growing fast. By the time she turned 3, Thomas had installed a swing set in our backyard for her. He didn't ask me, didn't discuss the cost, just showed up one Saturday with tools and lumber like he was building his legacy. At her birthday party held at our house, I stood at the kitchen window watching him push her on the swing. She screamed with laughter. He smiled like the sun was shining just for them. Parents who didn't know us assumed he was the father. He let them believe it. Introduced himself as Harper's Thomas. And I stood by the cake table smiling politely, slicing slices I couldn't bring myself to eat. Danielle floated through the party like the first lady, elegant, smug, adored. Anthony was there too, sitting alone on the porch, nursing a beer, like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. His face had that hollow look I'd grown too familiar with grief, with nowhere to go. When the guests left, Thomas came inside humming. "She had a great time, didn't she?" he said, taking off his jacket. "Best birthday yet." "Our house," I reminded him, "is not her daycare." "She's family," he replied, "you know that." No, she wasn't. She was Danielle's daughter. And the man who promised to build a life with me had built it for someone else, on land he didn't own, in a home he never respected, using resources I had quietly worked for. That night I opened my private business account. The balance shocked even me. Between book sales, licensing deals, and quiet brand partnerships, I had passed the $500,000 mark. And not once had I used it as leverage. I still paid half the groceries, still cleaned the guest bathroom, still hosted his co-parenting fantasy in my home, but not for much longer. If you've ever let someone take up space in your life because you were too kind, too hopeful, too exhausted to push back, comment below. I see you. And your patience isn't weakness. It's gathering strength. Anthony and I discussed timelines. Our divorce paperwork was on hold not because I was unsure, but because I needed to be strategic. Because now that Harper was old enough to speak, to form attachments, to remember, everything mattered. 5 more years, he said. We'll keep documenting. Let them live their illusion, but when the time comes, we take it all back. I nodded, because we weren't just building a case anymore. We were building a reckoning, and the day Thomas came to serve me divorce papers, he didn't know I already had a lawyer, and that every signature he demanded would be the start of his undoing. I was in a hospital bed when Thomas finally showed his true face. 3 years into our quiet investigation, my body already strained by stress and years of emotional neglect finally gave out. I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder, aggressive and unforgiving. My joints ached, my energy vanished, and suddenly everything about my life required assistance: eating, walking, sleeping, even drawing. I remember thinking, if ever there was a time a husband should show up, it's now. But Thomas? He showed up the way someone shows up to check a box. No warmth, no concern, just obligation. He'd stand near the doorway like the hospital bed was contagious. Ask the same questions each visit. How are you feeling? Are the doctors saying anything new? Always followed by the same exit line, work's been crazy. Work. Always work. The same work that somehow always aligned with Harper's nap schedule, Danielle's OB appointments, or weekend trips to Home Depot for nursery upgrades. But you know who did show up? Harper. 9 years old, backpack bouncing sneakers, untied hair, always in some variation of a crooked braid. She came to see me every day after school. She brought me her reading homework, her math worksheets, even coloring books. Sat next to me and said things like, "You can help me with the big words and I'll help you smile more." She told me about the boy in her class who called her weird for eating almond butter sandwiches. About the substitute teacher who looked like a witch from a storybook. She once fell asleep in the visitor's chair, clutching my hand as my IV beeped steadily in the background. That child who was never mine loved me like I was. I still remember the day she said, "Why doesn't Thomas come visit you more?" I smiled, fighting the sting behind my eyes. "He's just busy with work, sweetheart." Harper didn't miss a beat. Daddy Anthony says work should never come before family. I had to turn my face toward the window so she wouldn't see the tears fall. Because in that moment, it hit me Harper wasn't being raised by her mother or by Thomas. She was being raised by love, by presence, and neither of them were giving it to her. But Anthony was, quietly, consistently, the same way he'd been there for me through every surgery, every flare-up, every lawyer's appointment. While Thomas dropped by once a week and barely stayed long enough to finish his coffee, Anthony sat through specialist briefings, helped rearrange my furniture at home for accessibility, and managed my prescriptions when I was too tired to think straight. If you've ever seen someone love your child or your life better than the person who was supposed to leave a comment, because love isn't declared, it's demonstrated. As my health stabilized, Harper continued visiting. But after her 15th birthday, something changed. The texts stopped. The daily visits became weekly, then monthly, then silence. At first, I blamed teenage independence. Maybe she was outgrowing me. Maybe school and friends and growing pains were pulling her attention. But deep down, I knew that kind of distance wasn't accidental. So I called Thomas. "Where's Harper? I haven't seen her in weeks." He paused before responding. "She's busy, Emily. Teenagers have lives. You can't expect her to come running every day like she used to." But his tone, curt dismissive, held something more. Something calculated. That evening, Anthony confirmed what I feared. Thomas had been talking to Harper, telling her things, twisting truths. That I was manipulative. That I'd exaggerated my illness for sympathy. That I was jealous of their family. He had poisoned the very bond that had held me together through the darkest time of my life. And Harper, she believed him. The girl who once brought me construction paper cards and promised to write a book with me one day, now looked at me like I was a villain in someone else's story. Thomas thought I was too weak to fight back, too sick, too tired. But what he didn't understand, what he never could understand, was that the strength forged in betrayal is a strength unlike any other. He hadn't destroyed me. He'd refined me. And the next time he'd see me, I wouldn't be asking questions. I'd be handing out answers. If you've ever had to rebuild yourself in silence, brick by painful brick, say it below. Because some of us weren't broken, we were just in the process of becoming unshakable. 2 years passed in near silence. No calls, no messages, no visits. Harper, my bright, curious sunflower of a girl, had vanished from my life like a ghost. At first, I'd kept her birthday on my calendar, sent her texts with links to art tutorials and photos of new Benny the Brave illustrations. But eventually, even I had to stop. The silence wasn't an accident. It was strategic, and I knew exactly who had orchestrated it. Thomas had spent years slowly rewriting the narrative, not just to Harper, but to everyone around us. He cast himself as the devoted father figure, the patient friend, the long-suffering husband who tried to make it work with a woman who never appreciated him. It was a campaign, and sadly it worked. Friends who once laughed in our kitchen now avoided eye contact in public. Danielle wore smug-like perfume, flaunting her new life with Thomas and Harper, as if she hadn't scorched earth to get it. And me, I stayed quiet, on the outside. But behind the scenes, I was building something bigger than vengeance. I was building legacy. While they played family in my shadow, I signed one of the largest licensing deals in my publisher's history. Benny the Brave was going international, translated into 12 languages, with Netflix greenlighting an animated feature. I hired a business manager, a legal team, and a financial advisor. My name was now a brand, and I protected it like armor. But still none of that compared to what they took from me, Harper. Then came the knock on my door. It was a rainy Tuesday, just like the day I first saw Thomas cradle Harper in the hospital. I was in my home studio reviewing character sketches for the spin-off series when I heard the doorbell, and there she was. Harper. 16, now taller, her features sharper, more guarded. She stood on the porch in a hoodie too big for her, holding a trembling phone and a manila envelope. I didn't speak first. "I'm sorry," she said, voice thin, cracking. "I should have come sooner." I opened the door wider. She stepped in slowly, like she wasn't sure she was allowed anymore. Her eyes scanned the house, pausing at the walls lined with framed book covers, each one a milestone she used to celebrate with me. Then she handed me the envelope. Inside were copies of texts, emails, even voice recordings, all from Thomas. Lies, manipulations, proof that he had deliberately poisoned her perception of me, all under the guise of protecting her from drama. She'd found them accidentally while using his laptop. What she uncovered broke her. "I thought you were the jealous one," she whispered. "I thought you didn't want me to be happy with them." Her voice cracked again, but he was lying. About everything. I sat beside her on the couch and reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "I missed you," I said. "I never stopped loving you," she replied, "even when I thought I should." If you've ever had someone come back after being pulled away by lies, comment below. Because sometimes love isn't loud. It just waits until the fog clears. Harper told me everything. How Thomas had painted me as manipulative, unwell, jealous. How he used her innocence to build loyalty. How Danielle encouraged it, framing me as toxic and unstable. But Harper had always been smarter than they gave her credit for. When the pieces no longer fit, she went looking for the truth. And when she found it, she came straight to me. That night we talked for hours. About art, about school, about who she wanted to be now that she knew who they really were. And before she left, she hugged me tight, the kind of hug you give someone when you realize you almost lost them forever. That hug shattered something in me, but not in a painful way. It broke the part of me that thought I would never matter again. Because even if Thomas had stolen years from me, I still had time to reclaim what he could never touch, love built on honesty. The next morning I called Anthony. "It's time," I said. And he knew exactly what I meant. Because the reckoning wasn't just coming, it had already begun. The day Thomas and Danielle walked into my hospital room, smirking, smug, dressed like they were attending some kind of twisted celebration, was the day they thought they'd finally won. Thomas wore his sharpest suit, the one I helped him pick out for his first big job interview years ago. Danielle clung to his arm like a prize, her engagement ring flashing under the fluorescent lights. They looked like a power couple on a victory lap. And me, I was lying in a hospital bed with an IV in my arm, recovering from another round of treatments. I looked weak. I looked small. I looked like someone who couldn't fight back. That's what they were counting on. Thomas approached my bed with exaggerated confidence and dropped a business card on my tray table like he was delivering a verdict. "This is my lawyer's contact information. We're getting divorced," he said, barely hiding the satisfaction in his voice. We figured it's time to move forward. Danielle squeezed his arm in solidarity. Her face said it all. "You're done. He's mine now. We're the future." Thomas continued. "Given your situation, you don't work and you've been living off my support, we think $1,000 a month in alimony is fair. For me." I stared at him. At first I didn't even react. Because the audacity was so complete, so absurd, it took me a moment to process it. This man who had built an entire second life while living in my house, who had used my money to play dad to someone else's child, was now asking me for support? "I'm done being tied to a lazy, worthless woman," he added with a sneer. That was the moment I realized he didn't just want to leave. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to reduce me to nothing, to the fragile, dependent version of me that only existed in his imagination. But what he didn't know, what he'd never bothered to find out, was that the woman in this hospital bed had built something far more powerful than his ego could ever comprehend. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I smiled. "Fine," I said calmly. "Let's get divorced." Thomas blinked, clearly thrown off. This wasn't the script he'd rehearsed. Danielle's expression tightened. "That's it?" she asked. "You're just going to agree?" What did you expect? I said, tilting my head. You've made your choice. I'm just accepting it. They didn't know what to do with that. They'd walked in expecting a breakdown, a plea for mercy, a dramatic scene they could twist into a narrative of instability. But instead, I gave them peace. Serene, unsettling peace. Oh, I'm being very reasonable. I added, my voice low but sharp. You'll see. They left that day convinced they'd won. They had no idea they'd just lit the match that would burn their entire fantasy to the ground. If you've ever chosen dignity over drama even when your heart was breaking, drop a comment below. Because sometimes the loudest revenge is calm. That same night I opened my laptop. My hands still trembled from the treatment, but I typed every word with clarity. First I called my lawyer, then my accountant, then my business manager. And finally I called the woman who had been helping me manage property registration for months. Sarah, I said, remember that conversation we had about asset protection? That house registered under my business name. Yes, she said. You ready to move forward? I didn't hesitate. I want Thomas out. Start the eviction process tomorrow. There was a pause on the line. Are you sure that's going to blindside him? That's exactly what I want. 10 days later, while I was still in recovery, my phone lit up with a voicemail. Thomas had been served. He had 72 hours to vacate the home he thought he owned my home. The same home he had used to raise another woman's child while pushing me into the background. The first message was furious. You can't do this. It's illegal. I'll call my lawyer. Delete? The second was panicked. Where are we supposed to go? Danielle has Harper. You can't just throw us out. Delete. The third? It was the most revealing. Look, maybe we rushed things. Maybe we should talk, work something out. I'm willing to pay rent. I picked up that one. Thomas, I said calmly. You've been living in my property, rent-free, for 8 years. That was a courtesy I no longer offer. The lease has been terminated. Talk to your lawyer. And then I hung up, because that wasn't a conversation. That was closure. Thomas and Danielle never saw it coming. 3 days after the eviction notice was delivered, a sheriff arrived at the house they had made their sanctuary. My house with legal paperwork in hand. They had 72 hours to gather their belongings and get out. No negotiation. No grace period. Just a cold, sharp line that said, "You're not welcome here anymore." And when the clock ran out, they were gone, forced to move in with Thomas's parents. Yes, the same parents who had once thrown us a backyard wedding reception with mason jars and fairy lights. The same parents who believed Thomas was a man of principle, a loyal husband, a future father to be proud of. Imagine the awkward silence when they learned he had abandoned his sick wife for his wife's best friend, and was now showing up on their doorstep unemployed and unwelcome with a child that wasn't his. Margaret Thomas's mother was devastated, not just by the betrayal itself, but by the realization that she had raised a man capable of it. I thought I raised you better, she told him. Loyalty means something, Thomas. I wasn't there to see that moment, but Anthony was, and he told me everything. And Margaret, she didn't stop at words. Within 2 weeks, Thomas was fired from the construction business his father ran. The job he had always treated like a safety net, the one he assumed he'd have forever, was gone. His father didn't raise his voice. He just said, "You don't get to play house with someone else while still cashing checks from mine." Thomas tried to appeal, blamed stress, said he wasn't thinking clearly, claimed Danielle needed him, but his father didn't budge. Instead, he arranged for Thomas to work on a commercial fishing boat. Minimum wage, backbreaking hours, wake-up calls at 3:30 a.m., freezing salt water, no Wi-Fi, no fancy lattes, just the ocean and the smell of guilt clinging to every soaked pair of boots. Meanwhile, Danielle's unraveling was even more theatrical. Once evicted, she realized quickly that she had no legal standing, no claim to any shared assets, no protection. The marriage completely invalid. Anthony had never signed the final divorce paperwork. By law, she was still his wife. Bigamy, fraud. Everything she thought she had gained gone. She had to rent a one-bedroom studio apartment across town, barely affordable even with 2 part-time jobs. She went from latte runs in yoga pants to folding clothes at a strip mall retail store. Her social circle evaporated overnight. Former friends crossed the street when they saw her. Book club moms removed her from the group chat. She had become a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties. And the one person she thought she could count on. Thomas stopped answering her calls after 3 months. The man who said he'd build a life with her walked away the second the foundation crumbled. Just like he walked away from me. Exactly like I knew he would. If you've ever watched someone destroy their own future brick by brick, drop a comment. Because sometimes karma doesn't knock. It kicks the whole door down. But for me, the most important part of this wasn't watching them fall. It was watching Harper rise. As the lies unraveled, she began reaching out again. At first, it was cautious texts about school, short calls about college applications. Then one day she asked to visit. She stood in my kitchen, now bright and open, redesigned since Thomas's departure, and asked if we could make tea like we used to. I watched her stir honey into her mug and saw the same spark I'd once seen when she was a little girl sitting beside me at the hospital. "I want to be a translator," she said. "Maybe help your books go global." She was brilliant, curious, kind. She was everything her mother had tried to mold, and everything she'd become in spite of her. And as we talked about her plans, her dreams, her life beyond the wreckage, I realized something. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about reclamation of my voice, of my peace, of my place in a story they tried to write me out of. They had tried to erase me, but all they did was make room for a better version of me to rise. And the next chapter, I would write it entirely on my own terms. 6 months after I reclaimed my house and my peace, I found myself standing on a porch I never thought I'd revisit. Anthony's. It was a crisp Sunday afternoon, the kind where the sun filters through autumn leaves just right, and the air feels like it's whispering something new is coming. He opened the door wearing a faded Northwestern hoodie and a look that could only be described as relief. We didn't say much at first. We just sat at the kitchen table, the same table where years ago Danielle and I used to share wine and gossip about our husbands. Back when I thought Thomas was building a life with me. Back when Anthony still believed in Danielle's soft lies. Now those conversations were ghosts, and in their place sat two people who had seen the worst of each other's storms and quietly helped each other survive. He poured coffee. I brought lemon shortbread cookies I'd baked that morning. Somewhere between the first sip and the second cookie, he slid a folder across the table. I knew what it was before I opened it. "Our divorce is finalized. Clean, clear, no loose threads." Anthony looked up. "I know this might seem sudden," he said, voice steady, "but I've been thinking about this for a long time." He paused, then continued. "We've already seen each other at rock bottom. There's nothing left to hide. No illusions. No pretending. I trust you more than I've trusted anyone in years. And I think—" He stopped, searching for the words. "I think we could build something real. Not perfect, not shiny, just real." I didn't answer right away. Because this wasn't a fairy tale proposal. It wasn't flowers and rings and grand speeches under twinkle lights. It was raw, honest, grounded. And honestly, it was exactly what I needed. "I need time," I said quietly. "Not because I don't believe in us, but because I want to choose this for the right reasons. Not out of survival, not out of shared pain, but because we deserve a story that begins with clarity, not chaos." Anthony nodded. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." We kept meeting every Sunday after that. Sometimes just for tea, sometimes to work on Harper's college essays, sometimes to review licensing contracts because by then I trusted him enough to involve him in business decisions. But mostly we talked about healing, about what it meant to rebuild after betrayal, about how strange it was that two people who had once been background characters in each other's lives were now the only ones who truly understood the full story. Meanwhile, Harper blossomed. Freed from her mother's manipulation and her false father's emotional confusion, she leaned into her own future. She was accepted into a top community college with a language immersion program. Her dream to study abroad and become a literary translator. She told me she wanted to translate Benny the Brave into Spanish herself. "You think a little fox can teach kids how to stand up for themselves in Madrid," she joked one afternoon. I smiled. "I think he already has." If you've ever found healing in the most unexpected places, in quiet kitchens, awkward conversations, or people you never thought would stay, leave a comment. Because sometimes the best things grow from what others throw away. 6 months later, I stood in my brand new studio. Sunlight poured through the skylights. The walls were lined with storyboards, sketches, voiceover scripts for the Netflix adaptation. My phone buzzed with a message from a Hollywood executive asking if I'd be open to a sequel deal. And beneath that message, a text from Harper. "You'll always be my favorite person to come home to." That was the moment I realized something important. Thomas and Danielle thought they had rewritten my story. But all they did was clear the page. They gave me space to write something better. Something truer. Something mine. And with every word, every stroke of my pen, every quiet Sunday spent in the company of people who chose me without condition, I was writing the one thing I had been denied for so long, a future that belonged fully to me. There's something almost poetic about watching someone regret losing you, but only after they realize what you were worth. It happened at the most unexpected time. I had just finished a final call with my publisher confirming that the Benny the Brave animated series had secured its voice cast. I was in my living room, still in pajama pants, coffee half drunk, when my phone lit up. Thomas. I hadn't seen his name on my screen in over a year. For a moment I hesitated, then curiosity got the better of me. I answered. Rachel, he said, his voice softer than I remembered. I was wondering if we could talk, just talk. I didn't say anything. He took that as permission to keep going. I've been thinking about us, about everything. 15 years is a long time. We went through a lot together. I made mistakes. I see that now. But maybe we ended things too fast. I wanted to laugh, not out of joy, but because it was so predictable. The man who called me lazy now wanted me back. Not when I was at my lowest, lying in a hospital bed, but now that the world was finally recognizing my name. Now that the woman he discarded had built something bigger than him. Thomas, I said slowly, you left me for my best friend. You told me I was worthless. And when you found out I was worth $450 to $1,000 a year, you came back. Not because you love me, but because you love what you lost. He stammered, that's not fair. No, I interrupted. It's exactly fair. Then, almost like clockwork, Danielle's voice erupted in the background. You're calling her after everything. What about me? It was chaos, scrambling, shouting. I could hear Harper's name thrown in somewhere, his last desperate shield. Rachel, please, he said again, quieter. We can fix this. That was when I smiled, truly smiled, because there was nothing left to fix. I looked around my home. Sunlight bouncing off award plaques, fan art from kids who wrote me letters saying Benny gave them courage, Harper's latest hand-drawn postcard pinned to my fridge. This wasn't just a comeback. It was a reclamation. If you've ever had someone try to return when it's too late, comment below. Because closure isn't always slamming the door. Sometimes it's smiling while they realize you've already walked through a better one. I wish you peace, I told him simply, but this chapter's closed. And I ended the call. No anger, no revenge speech, just calm. Because the best revenge was never about destruction. It was about resurrection. Later that week, I sat on the front porch with Anthony. Yes, that Anthony, watching Harper read a Spanish-translated proof of Benny el Valiente, her fingers tracing the sentences she had helped perfect. The woman who once begged for love was now surrounded by it in friends who stayed in work, that mattered in a child who chose her, and in a man who never once made her feel small to feel tall himself. Anthony turned to me and asked, do you regret any of it? I thought for a long moment. No, I said. Not anymore. They didn't destroy me. They revealed me. That night, I wrote the final line of my new book, a story about a fox who loses his forest, his friends, even his voice, but eventually finds a new home inside himself. I closed my journal and whispered the words to myself. The bravest thing you'll ever do is choose yourself and never look back. If you've ever had to walk away from a love that nearly destroyed you and build something stronger from the rubble like this video, subscribe and leave your story in the comments. Because this isn't just my story, it's ours, and your voice deserves to be heard. There are moments in life that seem designed to break you, yet they become the very moments that reveal who you are. For years, I dimmed my own light to protect someone else's comfort. I hid my achievements to avoid unsettling their pride. I tolerated betrayal because I thought loyalty meant enduring in silence. What I learned is that loyalty to yourself must come first. Being called lazy, worthless, and replaceable could have crushed me. Instead, those words became a turning point. They stripped away illusions and left me with a choice: accept the version of myself they created or reclaim the truth of who I was. I chose the latter. True strength is not about never falling apart. It's about standing back up and deciding you are worth more than the limits others place on you. Love is not proved through endless sacrifice. It's shown through presence, respect, and unwavering support. In losing what I thought was everything, I discovered that I was never just part of someone else's story. I was always the author of my own. And when you realize that, you stop waiting for someone to save you. You stop asking for permission to live fully. The bravest thing you will ever do is choose yourself and keep walking forward without looking back.